Back with some more holiday baking here in the Culinary Barn, and I'm doing some evening baking, some nighttime baking, if you will. I feel at the holiday season, I am baking and cooking and prepping morning, noon, and night. And I just didn't have enough hours in the day to film this earlier, so it's nighttime and I'm doing it now, which explains why the lighting is a little different in here. Nonetheless, we're making one of my absolute favorite holiday recipes. I actually think it probably is, I say it now, my favorite cookie that I'm going to make for you now. I do believe it falls into the cookie category. There might be some people out there that will challenge that, but I do feel it is an actual cookie. I'm going to have one more holiday recipe for you that I'm actually going to post during the holiday break because I typically like to make it for New Year's Eve, and that's my tortilla recipe. So stay tuned for that on the channel. But tonight we're doing Rugelach or Rugelach, depending on however you want to say it. These incredible little kind of Jewish deli cookies that have a cream cheese pastry that's wrapped around brown sugar and apricot jam and nuts and spices. And when it's baked off, it just has the perfect texture of all things good and all things seasonal. And I make these every year. Actually, not always at Christmas because, like I said, they're one of my favorites. So they just happen to be more popular at Christmas time, but you can find them in delis year round. And it's actually a very simple recipe to put together. Essentially a pastry, some filling, roll them up. Definitely one you can make in advance, even just making them up until the point they go into the oven. You can flash freeze them and just keep them in your freezer, pull out as many as you need at a time. Or you can actually do the whole process, bake them off, and then flash freeze those. And then you can just pull them out and bring them to room temperature and serve them after a lovely meal with some tea. They're just the perfect little cookie. And you can also make them as big or as small as you like. I tend to go for the smaller size. They're a little bit more dainty looking, and they're sort of like a 2 or 3 biter, the ones I'm going to show you how to make today. So ingredients that are required, again, mostly pantry staples. For the pastry itself, we're just looking at some regular old all-purpose flour, some sugar, salt, vanilla, and then the good stuff, the fats. And in this case, we've got a combination of softened unsalted butter and cream cheese. Sometimes I make this with mascarpone. Kind of depends on what I have in the fridge. Both versions work out beautifully. What's most important here is that you have to make sure that your cream cheese is softened and at room temperature. To try and make this recipe with hard or very chilled cream cheese, the dough is going to take much more effort than needs to be. Another little trick is I'm going to do this in the food processor. You can, of course, make this by hand, just pushing the butter and the cream cheese into the flour to create the pastry dough. But if you happen to have a food processor, this makes it all the more easier. And then for the filling, we're going to do my favorite combination, which is quite classic. I'm going to do a little smear of apricot jam down on the pastry as my glue. And then for my fillings, I like to go with walnuts, sultanas, sometimes currants, but almost always sultanas or raisins, brown sugar, and then whatever kind of spice blend I'm feeling like. Always includes cinnamon, always includes a touch of allspice. And then other times I just sort of play around. Maybe we'll do a little cardamom today, maybe a little bit of nutmeg. See how I feel when I get there. But we need to start with the pastry dough itself. And like I said, for this recipe today, I'm going to do it in the food processor. I'm going to do that part off camera. And all I'm going to do is take my all-purpose flour, white sugar, a pinch of salt, and then I'm going to put this in the bowl of the food processor, top it off with my softened unsalted butter, my cream cheese, and then I'm going to pulse that about 15 to 20 times just until it comes together into a soft dough ball. And just like that, our dough is ready. Just pull it out of the food processor. Just be mindful of the blade. And it's a nice soft dough on account of all that lovely fat that we put in there. So I'm just going to give this just a quick knead with my hands. So again, this was just flour, salt, sugar. I did put a nice healthy teaspoon of vanilla bean paste in here, but that's optional. and then our softened cream cheese and softened butter. So just to make rolling just a scotch easier, I'm just going to wrap this lightly in cling film and pop it in the fridge just for about 15 or 20 minutes. So I've pulled the dough from the fridge, just about 15, maybe 20 minutes or so, just to get a bit of a chill on it. So it's just a little bit easier to roll out. A little bit of bench flour down on your work surface. And then I'm just going to roll this out into a circle. And remember, when you're rolling, you never want to go completely off the edge of the pastry or whatever it is that you're rolling, because every time you go off and you make contact with your surface, your outer edge of the dough is always going to get thinner and thinner, and that tends to stick to your surface. Another little note is try to roll on wood if you can. I find it's the best thing for making fresh pasta dough, kneading bread dough, and also rolling pastry out on. You don't need as much bench flour as you do on a stone surface or a glass surface, but that's of course optional. And the other good rule of thumb is just constantly keep moving the dough around. Do a couple of passes, a little bit of flour on my pin, a couple of passes. I prefer to just move my body around with the pin. And then after a few passes, just make sure you can still move it. And I also like to flip it around as well. So I'm just going to continue rolling this out to somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch. And don't worry if you don't have an absolutely perfect circle. Just aim for something close to a circle, and then you can kind of shimmy it up a little bit after you're done rolling out and tidy up the edges if needed. We're pretty close here. The other thing I like to do when rolling out is just every once in a while, rub your hand over the top of it, just gently, and you can feel for any discrepancy in the elevation. So if you have a little part that's a little bit thicker, you can just focus on that area for a moment. All right, we're almost there. Now, if it's easier for you, for this particular recipe, you can split this into 2 smaller dough balls and do smaller round rolled out rounds, and you'll just get quite little tiny rugelach, which is totally fine. All right, this is looking good. We're just about there. Okay, so like I said, it's not an absolutely perfect circle, but what you can do is just take your knife and just, without much fuss, don't try to be super perfect here, but just tidy up your edges a little bit so you have more of a even circle to work with. We'll just put these little bits aside. All right, and there we have our round dough. So for the filling, this is my personal preference. The nut of choice for me, and it can change, but I would say 95% of the time, I prefer to go with walnuts. Now, these are whole walnuts and walnut halves, which are a little too big to go in to the dough itself. So take my little mound here, and you could of course do this in a food processor as well, but otherwise just run your knife through your whole or halved walnuts just to break them down a little bit so they're easier to roll up into the pastry dough. And again, this doesn't have to be overly precise, just a rough kind of milling with your knife. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, then chopped walnuts into the bowl. And then for sweetness, brown sugar, nice caramely, molassesy brown sugar. And this is where you can have some fun with the spices. So I, of course, have to have cinnamon. So I'm going to do just about kind of 1 good heaped teaspoon, and a bit for luck, as it were. I am going to put just a tiny pinch of salt in here as well, just for balance. And then I'm thinking, yes, let's do just a tiny bit of allspice, just a little kiss of it. And I think cardamom as well. Really lovely warming spices. Maybe just about a 1/4 teaspoon of that. And then the last ingredient for our filling is the sultanas. And just give this toss with your hands just to get all of those spices incorporated. Finished. On to the jam or preserves. Again, classically, this is apricot jam, but you can kind of play around with whatever jam flavors you like. And this is just enough to do a light, little thin layer. You don't want to put too much jam on because then it'll fall out the sides. And although it is nice to have a little bit of kind of crispy caramelized edges on these, you don't want so much coming out that it potentially burns on the edges of your cookies. So just a thin amount, you don't need too much. And you could use any type of apricot spreads you like, including ones that still have some texture in them, if that's what you like. All right. So you have a couple of options here on how you want to put the filling in. My preference is to pre-cut my wedges and then sprinkle my filling on top. But if you prefer, you can sprinkle it on first, gently pat it in, and then cut through. But I'm going with the way that I learned. So you can, of course, use a knife, or if you happen to have a pastry wheel or pasta wheel, just use the flat edge for that. And I'm just gonna cut this into quarters, and then each quarter into halves. And then each one of those quarters I'm going to do into 3. All right, now we have all of our beautiful wedges done. I'm going to take my filling and just sprinkle it over the top, and leaving myself a border at the top. It's about an inch or so. I also didn't take the jam all the way to the border. And then just try and evenly spread it about so that each little rugelach gets a little bit of everything. And then just gently tap it down so that it adheres to the apricot jam. Like so. So to roll these up, just grab an end and then just, as you would a little croissant, just roll it up. And then you want to make sure that your little tail is tucked underneath. And just keep rolling all the way around your circle until you have all your little rugelach ready to go onto a parchment lined tray. Our rugelach are all rolled up and ready to go into a preheated 350-degree oven. The last little thing I like to do is a little egg wash, which is just egg yolk with a touch of cream. And I just, a little bit, very genteel with this. I don't want a pool of egg wash over top of each of these, just a little bit. It'll make them nice and golden, amber kind of brown on top. And if you'd like to, you could sprinkle cinnamon sugar on top of these for a little bit of extra gilding of the lily. Or you could use coarse sugar, like a raw, coarse brown sugar, or sanding sugar as well, if you would like. All right, that is the last one done. So I'm just double checking to make sure that all the little tails are tucked underneath before they go into the oven. And like I said, if you would like to gild the lily a little bit, you can just take a little bit of coarse sugar and just sprinkle it on the top for a little bit of extra crunch. But of course, this is completely optional. These have plenty of sweetness in them without. And these are ready for the oven. They're going to take about 15 to 18 minutes total, and then maybe just a short 4 to 5 minute cool down, and then they're ready to serve. Our beautiful Rugelach are out of the oven and they smell incredible. Such a great smell to have around the holidays, or like I said, any time of year. Rugelach aren't just for the holidays, they are a year-round treat. And they are beautiful golden brown with the help of that egg wash that we put on top. So I'm going to try very hard to let these rest for about 5 minutes or so before I take a bite. And like I said, you can flash freeze these and then throw them into a storage container or bag and just have them in your freezer. Pull out as many as you need at a time and maybe just give them a little warm up in the oven for 5 or 6 minutes to bring them back to life from the freezer. And they're almost just as good as straight from the oven. All right, they are ready for a test. I've put a few of them up on a little pedestal here for friends to enjoy, but now I get to have a little test. I will be sure to put this recipe on the website, but also this recipe is included in the latest edition of my Substack, which is called Shaking Out the Tablecloth. This, as well as the last couple holiday recipes that I did on the YouTube channel, are also available there. And I will certainly put the tortilla in the next episode as well, or sorry, the next edition of Shaking Out the Tablecloth as well. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Enjoy.